The boardroom was hushed, heavy with unease. James Harper sat rigidly, sweat beading on his brow as he clutched the armrests of his leather chair. Opposite him, Michael Bennett stayed calm, methodically turning pages in a stack of papers with calculated precision. The gravity of the situation bore down on James as it dawned on him this wasn't just any customer he had wronged earlier. This was the man who held his career in his hands. Michael finally raised his eyes, his face inscrutable. "You could have approached this differently, Mr. Harper," he said. James's throat tightened. How had it come to this? Hours before, Michael had simply entered Pinnacle National Bank to cash a check. What had gone so horribly awry? Before we delve into this compelling tale, let us know your location. And if you champion fairness and equality, give a like and subscribe for more impactful stories like this one.
Hours before, Michael had simply entered Pinnacle National Bank to cash a check. What had gone so horribly awry? Before we delve into this compelling tale, let us know your location. And if you champion fairness and equality, give a like and subscribe for more impactful stories like this one. Michael Bennett walked into Pinnacle National Bank, the cool interior a sharp contrast to the muggy Chicago afternoon. The gleaming marble floors shone beneath elegant chandeliers, and the scent of polished leather blended with the fresh smell of paper. The bank epitomized wealth and status, priding itself on serving its elite patrons. Michael adjusted his tailored navy suit, standing tall with purposeful movements. He was there to cash a check, a straightforward task, or so it seemed. Yet the moment he stepped inside, he sensed it. A faint, almost intangible tension, like the charged air before a storm. Most customers barely noticed his arrival. Well-dressed professionals, retirees in fine suits, a few younger people glued to their screens. But one person took immediate notice. The security guard by the entrance, a stocky man with a stern face, who straightened slightly, his eyes fixing on Michael with quiet scrutiny. Michael ignored him, though he felt the guard's stare trailing him as he approached the teller line. He was accustomed to this. The line moved steadily, and Michael waited patiently, his keen eyes observing the room. He noted how the teller smiled warmly at the white customers ahead, their tones friendly and professional. But as he stepped forward, a subtle change occurred. The young teller, Sarah, who had been chatting lightly with the previous customer about his mortgage, grew serious. She looked at him, her eyes briefly glancing at the check in his hand, before offering a polite but guarded smile. "How may I assist you, sir?" she asked, her voice courteous, but distinctly cooler than before. Michael had encountered this countless times. The slight tensing of shoulders, the brief widening of eyes, the way her fingers stiffened as she took the check. He remained composed, offering a professional smile as he slid the document across the counter. "I'd like to cash this," he said. Sarah's gaze fell to the check, and for a moment, her breath caught. Michael understood why. It was a $500,000 check from a prominent real estate firm, payment for a completed deal. But instead of processing it routinely, Sarah paused, her fingers tapping nervously as she glanced toward the back offices. "I'll need to get my manager's approval for this," she said, her tone uncertain. The words were standard. Large checks often required extra verification. But it was the hesitation, the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the quick glance toward the security guard as if seeking reinforcement. Michael nodded calmly. "Of course, no rush," he said. As Sarah walked away, Michael subtly scanned the room, his sharp instincts catching details others might miss. A man in a gray suit at the service desk glanced his way before quickly looking elsewhere. A woman in the waiting area set down her phone, her eyes drifting toward him. They weren't openly staring, but there was an unmistakable curiosity, a silent question hanging in the air. What's he doing here? He wasn't a celebrity or an athlete, just a well-dressed black man in an upscale bank with a large check, and that alone seemed enough to spark suspicion. Minutes ticked by. Sarah had vanished behind a frosted glass door, and Michael stood patiently at the counter, his composure unshaken. The security guard's gaze still weighed on him, a tangible pressure at his back. Then, from the corner of his eye, Michael saw the guard shift slightly, moving closer to the counter, adjusting his stance subtly. The message was clear. "I'm prepared if this turns bad." Michael exhaled slowly, maintaining his calm. This wasn't new. It had happened in restaurants, luxury hotels, boardrooms where people mistook him for an assistant rather than the CEO. But no matter how often it occurred, it never became easier to swallow. The difference today was that these people were about to make a monumental error. A door creaked, and footsteps echoed across the polished floor. Michael turned as James Harper, the branch manager, approached with the demeanor of someone already convinced something was amiss. In his mid-50s, tall and lean, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, his tailored suit exuded authority, but his expression betrayed him. The moment he saw Michael, his face tightened slightly, his posture subtly defensive. He stopped at the counter, his eyes fixed on the check Sarah had handed him. After a brief pause, his eyes narrowed slightly before he spoke. "Sir, may I see some identification for this check?" James asked, his tone low but firm. Michael's face remained neutral as he reached into his pocket and slid his driver's license across the counter. James barely glanced at it before handing it back, his lips pressed thin. "I see," he said, his tone carrying a hint of dismissal, a subtle doubt that had little to do with procedure and everything to do with assumption. He examined the check, turning it over as if searching for a flaw to justify his suspicion. Then, with a slight frown, he looked at Michael. "I'll need to verify this with the issuer," he said, his voice laced with the familiar skepticism Michael had heard too often. James wasn't accusing him outright, but he was treating him as if he had something to prove. It was a familiar tactic, the slow erosion of dignity through subtle slights. Michael tilted his head slightly, studying the man. "Is there a problem?" he asked. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the check a moment longer, before muttering, "Just a moment." Without another word, he turned and retreated to his office. The bank's atmosphere shifted, conversations quieted, a few heads turned. The tension, simmering beneath the surface, was now unmistakable. Michael stood at the counter, his posture upright, hands resting lightly on the polished wood. He was being tested, that much was obvious. And as he waited, his patience unwavering, he was ready to see how far they would push this. Time dragged on, but Michael Bennett remained composed, his fingers lightly tapping the counter. The room buzzed with quiet activity. Tellers assisting customers, the rustle of papers, the chime of transactions. But beneath it all, a growing tension pressed against him like an invisible force. He knew this game. React too strongly, and he'd be labeled aggressive. Push too hard, and they'd claim he was disruptive. So he waited 5 minutes, 10, 15. Around the 20-minute mark, he noticed a young teller with anxious eyes glancing toward James's office, then back at him, as if sensing something was off. Finally, the office door opened, and James returned, holding the check with a new air of determination, as if he'd already made up his mind. He approached the counter slowly, his eyes locking onto Michael's, and spoke with an air of finality. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear, "I'm sorry, but we can't process this transaction." The words landed like a blow. Murmurs grew louder, heads turned to watch. Michael stood still, his face unreadable. "You haven't verified anything," he said calmly, though his voice carried a hint of frustration. The issuer's contact is right there. Call them." James's lips twitched into a barely concealed smirk. "I don't need to waste time chasing details for something clearly suspicious," he said, waving the check as if it were tainted. "You're welcome to try another branch." The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. A woman near the entrance glanced between Michael and James. A teller whispered to her colleague, their eyes flickering toward the manager. The tension was now palpable, oppressive. Michael stepped closer to the counter, his calm now laced with quiet intensity. "So you're refusing to process this check because—" "Why, exactly?" he asked. James shrugged, his tone dripping with false civility. "We have procedures for a reason," he said, but his lingering gaze on Michael told a different story. Michael held his ground. "If it's not personal, why not follow protocol and verify it?" he asked. "Or are you implying I don't belong here?" The question caught James off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered, a smirk tugging at his lips. "This bank reserves the right to refuse service if something feels off," he said, his words carefully chosen, but their meaning clear. The murmurs grew louder, the tension thicker. Michael glanced around briefly, noting the uncomfortable expressions on other patrons' faces, yet none spoke up. "Interesting," Michael said softly, his voice cutting through the noise. He adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate. "So you're refusing service based on your instincts, not facts." James's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "I don't owe you further explanation," he snapped. "Take it to another branch if you want." For the first time, Michael's composed exterior wavered slightly. He leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "I will escalate this, Mr. Harper," he said. "And you'll wish you hadn't done this." James scoffed, though a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his earlier confidence waning. Michael didn't reply. Instead, he turned, pulled out his phone, and made a call, his movement steady, his composure intact despite the public slight. Behind him, James muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "Some people don't know when to give up." A few chuckled nervously. Others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. The room's tension was stifling, heavy with unspoken judgments. Michael, however, stood resolute. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to prove a point. At this moment, a question for you, the audience. Should Michael have walked away? Or was he right to stand his ground? Comment 1 if you think he should fight back, and share what you'd have done in his shoes. And don't forget to like and subscribe to see what happens next. But the real question is, who did Michael call? And how will it change everything? Michael Bennett stood in the heart of Pinnacle National Bank, phone to his ear, speaking in a low, steady tone, his expression unreadable. The room, already thick with tension, grew eerily quiet. Customers pretended not to eavesdrop, but their curiosity betrayed them, their eyes flicking between Michael and James Harper, the manager who had just publicly denied his transaction. James leaned against the counter, watching Michael with thinly veiled amusement, arms crossed. He thought he'd won, that Michael would make his call, realize he was powerless, and leave quietly like others before him. But Michael had no intention of leaving. James cleared his throat, addressing the onlookers. "We must be cautious about fraud these days," he said, his tone self-important. "It's unfortunate, but not everyone who comes here has honest intentions." His words, though veiled, carried a clear message. Michael didn't belong. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the waiting area glanced between James and Michael, her brow furrowed in quiet disapproval, but she stayed silent. The security guard, still near the entrance, adjusted his stance, making sure Michael noticed. A reminder, a warning. Michael didn't react. He ended his call, pocketed his phone, and turned back to the counter, his composure unshaken. "I've taken steps to resolve this," he said, his voice calm but weighty. "I suggest you hold off on further assumptions." James gave a dry laugh. "You're free to handle it as you wish, but this check isn't going anywhere," he said, tapping the paper against the counter like it was worthless. "I'm protecting this bank from potential fraud." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression still guarded. "Potential fraud," he echoed. "Based on what? My appearance? My occupation?" His voice was soft, but sharp. James hesitated for a moment, but quickly recovered. "I'm not implying anything," he said loudly, playing to the crowd. "Just following procedure." Michael let out a small, humorless chuckle. "Your procedures don't seem to involve checking facts," he said. "They seem to involve making baseless judgments in front of everyone." A hushed silence fell. Customers and staff strained to hear every word. James, now visibly annoyed, straightened his jacket and waved dismissively. "I've made my call. Escalate it if you want. But you're wasting your time." For the first time, Michael's calm cracked slightly. He leaned in, voice low but firm. "I will escalate it, Mr. Harper," he said, "and you'll regret this." James scoffed, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. "Is that a threat?" he asked, his confidence faltering. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone again, making another call, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. James, still at the counter, smirked and muttered, "Some people don't know when to stop." A few nervous laughs rippled through the bank. Others watched with growing unease. Then, heavy footsteps broke the silence. The atmosphere shifted. A group of sharply dressed individuals entered, their presence commanding instant attention. The leader, a tall woman in a tailored black blazer, exuding authority, scanned the room before her eyes settled on Michael. Elizabeth Carter, the regional director of Pinnacle National Bank. The room fell silent. James's face paled, his confident demeanor collapsing as he realized who Michael had called. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted. The moment Elizabeth Carter entered, the bank's atmosphere transformed. Conversations stopped, customers exchanged uneasy glances, and tellers stiffened. Her authority was undeniable. As regional director, Elizabeth commanded respect within these walls. She carried herself with the assurance of someone who had seen everything, wasting no time on formalities. Her sharp eyes swept the room, softening slightly as they met Michael's with a small nod, then hardening as they turned to James Harper, who was now visibly shaken. His smug confidence vanished, replaced by the stiffness of a man who knew he'd made a grave error. He swallowed hard, trying to stand taller, but his trembling fingers betrayed him as he adjusted his tie. Customers, sensing something significant was unfolding, stayed rooted, their eyes darting between Michael, James, and the executives who had followed Elizabeth inside. The security guard, who had loomed near Michael as a silent threat, stepped back, suddenly uncertain of his role. Elizabeth crossed the marble floor with deliberate steps, her heels clicking like a countdown to the inevitable. She stopped before Michael and extended her hand. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice professional yet warm. "I came as soon as you called." A stunned silence followed. A customer calling corporate was one thing, but the regional director herself showing up was extraordinary. Michael shook her hand, his expression composed, but resolute. "Thank you for coming, Elizabeth," he said evenly. She nodded before turning to James, her expression now stern. "You must be Mr. Harper," she said. James faltered, his throat bobbing as he struggled to respond. "Yes, that's me," he managed, his attempt at authority crumbling under Elizabeth's piercing gaze. She held up the check Michael had presented, turning it in her fingers before placing it on the counter. "This," she said sharply, "is a serious issue." James opened his mouth, but Elizabeth pressed on, her voice cutting like a knife. "Mr. Bennett is not just a client of this bank. He is one of our most valued partners." James's face drained of color. Gasps rippled through the lobby. An older man near the window nearly dropped his magazine. The teller who had first assisted Michael covered her mouth, stunned. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice low and deliberate. "Not just a partner, Mr. Harper," she said slowly. "Mr. Bennett is the majority shareholder of this institution." The bank fell into a stunned hush. The revelation hit like a tidal wave, washing away every assumption, every whispered judgment. Every suspicious glance cast at Michael was now exposed as a colossal mistake. James's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came. He looked like a man drowning in his own hubris, grasping for a lifeline that didn't exist. Michael stood silent, watching the realization crush James. He didn't need to gloat. The truth was enough. James's hands shook as he reached for the check, as if touching it could undo the moment. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Michael cut in, his voice cool, "because you didn't bother to find out." He stepped forward, his presence effortless. "Instead, you chose to publicly shame me." His words hung like a verdict, and James knew there was no defense. The customers who had dismissed Michael, who had watched silently as he was treated like a fraud, now saw the truth. Some shifted uncomfortably, aware of their complicity. Others avoided his gaze, unwilling to face what had happened. But Michael saw them all. Elizabeth, her patience wearing thin, turned back to James. "Your actions today were not just unprofessional. They were intolerable," she said. James's head snapped up. I was just following protocol," he sputtered. "I couldn't have known." "Enough," Elizabeth snapped, her voice icy. "You had every chance to verify the check. You had every chance to treat Mr. Bennett with the same respect you offer others who walk through these doors. Instead, you made a snap judgment, and you made it loudly." The room was silent. James tried to speak, but nothing came out. Sweat glistened on his brow. His earlier smirk was gone. He knew it was over. Michael took a deep breath, letting the moment settle. Then he did something James didn't expect. He turned to the customers, the tellers, everyone who had watched, and spoke. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady yet firm. "This isn't just about me. It's about how people are treated when assumptions override facts, when bias trumps professionalism." He gestured to the check in James's trembling hands. "I came here today expecting fair treatment, the same respect any client deserves. Instead, I was judged on sight, dismissed, and publicly humiliated." His words sank into the room. A young woman near the entrance nodded slightly, her face showing quiet agreement. The tension was thick, a mix of shock, guilt, and realization. The executives behind Elizabeth stood firm, their silence affirming that this would not be forgotten. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. "Mr. Bennett, we deeply regret how you were treated today," she said. "This does not reflect our values, and we will take immediate action to address this." Her gaze turned to James, her voice cold. "Mr. Harper," she said, "your actions violated our code of conduct. You failed to perform basic due diligence before leaping to conclusions. This behavior is unacceptable." James tried to respond, but Elizabeth cut him off. "Save it," she said. "Your actions are documented, and we'll handle this appropriately." The customers watched in stunned silence as James stepped back, his face pale, his arrogance replaced by panic. He turned to Michael, opening his mouth as if to apologize, but Michael had already turned away. There was nothing left to say. "Now, a question for you, the audience. Should James face immediate termination, or does he deserve a second chance? Comment 1 if you believe justice should be swift, and share what you'd have done. Like and subscribe to see what happens next. But the real question is, What will Michael do now? And will James ever grasp the cost of his actions? The room's tension was palpable, heavy and stifling. James Harper stood frozen, his face ashen, his mouth moving soundlessly. He had just learned the truth that would haunt him. Michael Bennett wasn't just a customer. He was the majority shareholder of Pinnacle National Bank. The revelation sent shockwaves through the lobby. Customers who had watched quietly now exchanged uneasy looks, whispering. Tellers who had hesitated to act now regarded Michael with shame and apprehension. The security guard, who had loomed as a silent threat, shifted uncomfortably, unsure of his place in this drama. Elizabeth Carter, still commanding the room, let the silence linger before speaking, her voice steady but laced with anger. "Your conduct today has not only embarrassed this bank, Mr. Harper," she said, "but it has revealed a systemic issue we cannot ignore." James stammered, clutching the check as if it could change reality. "I was just following protocol," he said weakly, his earlier arrogance gone. "That's the problem," Michael interjected, his voice sharp but controlled. "You didn't know, but you assumed. You assumed that because I walked in, well-dressed, with a six-figure check, I was trying to scam you. You assumed my appearance meant I couldn't have earned this money." James flinched, the truth hitting hard. Murmurs grew louder. A woman near the window shook her head, disapproving. "This is outrageous," she muttered to her neighbor. "How could he be so wrong?" An older man who had been reading a magazine spoke up, his voice carrying. "He didn't just judge Mr. Bennett," he said, staring at James. "He judged us all. He made a fool of himself because he let prejudice decide who deserved service." James's face burned, but Michael wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his presence effortless. "I came here expecting the same professionalism as anyone else," he said. "I expected you to do your job, verify the check like you would for others. Instead, you turned it into a spectacle, making sure everyone knew you saw me as a suspect, not a client. And when I challenged you, you doubled down, trying to shame me." James swallowed hard, his gaze dropping. The weight of his actions crushed him. Elizabeth stepped forward, her eyes boring into James. "Let me be clear, Mr. Harper," she said. "This isn't just about today. It's about every person who's been treated differently here because of someone's biases. It's about every client forced to prove themselves more than necessary, just to get the same service others receive freely. You represent what's wrong with that system." A heavy silence followed. Tellers exchanged uneasy glances. The security guard stepped back further, and James seemed to shrink. Michael turned to the onlookers, his words aimed at everyone. "How many of you saw this unfold and stayed silent?" he asked, his eyes sweeping the room. "How many have seen this before, in a bank, a store, an airport, and looked away?" The shifting feet, lowered eyes, and sudden quiet told Michael what he already knew. Too many had witnessed this before and done nothing. Elizabeth inhaled deeply before delivering her verdict. "Mr. Harper, you are suspended effective immediately, pending further investigation. Your behavior violates this bank's values, and further action will be determined." James's breath caught. "Suspended?" he whispered. "Please, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Elizabeth said coldly. "Your actions spoke for you." She turned to Michael. "Mr. Bennett, I deeply regret how you were treated. This will be addressed fully, and changes will be made at every level." Michael studied her, then nodded. "I hope so," he said. Elizabeth gave a curt nod to her team and stepped aside. The moment's weight lingered, heavy and oppressive. James stood defeated, his shoulders slumped. He had entered this believing he held all the power. Now he was a disgraced man awaiting his fate. The customers remained still, unsure what to do. The young teller who had first helped Michael stepped forward hesitantly, her voice steady but soft. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her hands trembling as she reached for the check. "Would you like me to process this now?" The offer was simple but heavy. Michael studied her, knowing she'd been caught in a situation beyond her control. He nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. "That would be appreciated." He turned to James one last time, his expression neutral. "You see, Mr. Harper," he said, his voice smooth. "Respect isn't something you give based on assumptions. It's owed to everyone who walks through those doors, whether they're cashing a $10 check or $10 million. Your job isn't to judge, it's to serve." James looked like he wanted to vanish. The silence was nearly suffocating. Michael turned away, moving to the counter where the teller quickly processed his transaction. Elizabeth watched, then exhaled. "Let's go," she said to her team, heading for the door. As the executives left, a low murmur filled the room. The lesson had been delivered, the damage done, and no one would forget what they'd seen. The assumptions that had fueled this encounter were shattered. The truth was exposed, and consequences were in motion. The bank remained quiet as the final words lingered, a heavy truth no one could ignore. Michael Bennett stood at the counter, his composure steady, watching the young teller's trembling hands process his check. The transaction, which should have been simple, had spiraled into a spectacle of bias, judgment, and consequences. The reality of what had happened settled over the room, irreversible. James Harper stayed rooted, shoulders slumped, his breath uneven. The arrogance he'd worn like armor was gone, stripped away as his actions' severity hit home. He had ruled this domain for years, deciding who was worthy of service, who deserved trust. But today, he was the one judged. As Elizabeth Carter and her team exited, whispers grew among customers, filled with shock. Some looked at Michael with newfound respect. Others avoided his gaze, their silence weighing on them. A woman near the waiting area leaned toward her neighbor. "I can't believe it," she murmured. "He was the one with the power all along." The older man with the cane nodded gravely. "The power was always there," he said quietly. "They just didn't see it." The young teller finished the transaction, sliding the receipt across with care. "It's approved, Mr. Bennett," she said softly. "Anything else I can help with?" Michael studied her, knowing she'd been caught in the middle. Her hands shook slightly with the weight of what she'd seen. He took the receipt, slipping it into his wallet with a nod. "That's all," he said, his voice carrying finality. James, still frozen, spoke faintly. "Mr. Bennett," he began, searching for words. But they failed him. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by raw humility, regret, fear. It didn't matter. Michael turned to him, expression neutral, offering no comfort. "You had a choice," Michael said steadily. "You could have handled this differently. You didn't." James exhaled shakily, his face pale, hands gripping the counter for support. His downfall was swift, merciless, yet Michael had shown him more dignity than James had offered. The security guard, who had loomed as a silent threat, shifted uneasily, his authority crumbling the moment Michael's identity was revealed. He had played a role, not with words, but with presence, standing too close, ready to enforce power for a man who had none. Michael stepped away from the counter, his eyes sweeping over those who had watched, those who had stayed silent, those who had judged before understanding. He didn't need to speak. The silence said enough. Some avoided his gaze, others nodded with quiet respect. A few remained unmoved, too proud to admit their role. The weight pressed on James, suffocating. His mind raced, seeking a way to salvage his dignity. But there was none. He had thought himself untouchable. Now he was a cautionary tale. He knew what awaited. Suspension was just the start. The investigation would not favor him. His superiors would distance themselves, sacrificing him to protect the bank's reputation. There would be no redemption. Michael adjusted his jacket, his movements deliberate, and headed for the doors. There was no gloating, no triumph, no need to revel in James's downfall. That wasn't his way. Power wasn't in revenge. It was in control, poise, and letting the lesson speak for itself. As he reached the doors, he paused, looking back, not at James, but at the people, the tellers, customers, security guard, those who had let this happen, those who would tell this story for years because it had changed them. "Next time," Michael said, his voice carrying, "Speak up." With that, he stepped into the warm Chicago air, leaving behind a bank full of people who would never see the world the same way. As Michael Bennett exited Pinnacle National Bank, the warm Chicago air enveloped him, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. The city buzzed, cars hummed, pedestrians moved with purpose. Voices and laughter filled the streets. But inside the bank, time stood still. He didn't need to look back to know the moment would linger. People would replay it, grappling with their assumptions. Some would wrestle with their silence, questioning why they hadn't acted. Others would justify their inaction, insisting it wasn't their place. And those like James Harper would carry the consequences of a moment they thought they controlled. Michael walked slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. His mind was calm, his pulse steady. He had entered as a customer, but left as a force of reckoning, a reminder of why power must be wielded with care. The check was cashed, the battle won. But this was never just about a check. It was about dignity, justice, and the subtle prejudice that thrives where people refuse to challenge it. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen without breaking stride. A message from Elizabeth Carter. "Changes are underway. Thank you for holding us accountable." A faint smile crossed his face. Change didn't happen in one moment, but moments like these forced people to confront truths they'd ignored. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. He pocketed the phone and kept walking. The sun hung high, casting shadows across the pavement, stretching between towering buildings, symbols of wealth and power, long guarded by men like James Harper. But power was shifting, slowly but surely. Footsteps followed him. Michael didn't turn. He knew who it was. "Mr. Bennett," a hesitant voice called. He paused, waiting. A moment passed, then he turned. Sarah, the young teller, stood there, hands clasped tightly, her face a mix of guilt, uncertainty, and courage. The weight of the day pressed on her. She'd seen it all, been part of it, and now couldn't return to normal. "I just wanted to say," she faltered, swallowing hard, "I should have done something." Michael studied her, letting her words settle. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was owning the truth. That was more than most. "Why didn't you?" he asked simply. She flinched, not from his tone, but from her own self-reflection. "I was scared," she admitted softly. "Scared of my manager, of losing my job, of making a mistake." A pause, then quieter. "Scared of getting involved." Michael nodded, considering her words. "And now?" he asked. She met his gaze, resolute. "Now I know staying silent is as bad as agreeing." There it was. Growth, awareness, change. Michael nodded, reaching into his pocket. He handed her a business card. Sarah hesitated, then took it, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. "If you're ever treated unfairly," Michael said steadily, "anywhere, call me." Her eyes widened, a spark of hope in them. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a final nod and turned back to the city. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, watching him blend into the crowd, clutching the card tightly. Inside the bank, tension lingered like an unspoken storm. James Harper had retreated to his office, his mind racing with the fallout awaiting him. Tellers avoided eye contact, their routine disrupted by something bigger. Customers whispered, some still processing, others eager to share the story. No one would leave unchanged. Michael's name would echo in meetings, his actions analyzed in corporate discussions, his quiet defiance etched into the bank's history. Policies would be rewritten, training revised, oversight strengthened. But more than that, a perspective had shifted, a bias exposed, a lesson learned. Blocks away, Michael kept walking, unhurried, his mind forward. This wasn't his first encounter with discrimination, nor would it be his last. But today was different. Today, the veil had lifted. Today, people had seen. He paused at a street corner, inhaling deeply. The city hummed, oblivious to the shift behind him. He exhaled and stepped forward, blending into the world's rhythm. Somewhere, a light turned green. Somewhere, a policy was drafted. Somewhere, a young teller sat at her kitchen table, staring at a business card, wondering how to ensure she'd speak up next time. Change had begun. It would not be forgotten. And Michael Bennett had ensured this moment of truth would resonate. The events at Pinnacle National Bank were more than an isolated incident. They reflected a broader issue plaguing boardrooms, businesses, and institutions worldwide. What happened to Michael Bennett wasn't unique. Every day, people are judged by assumptions, and too often, those in power refuse to confront their biases until it's too late. But today, Michael refused to stay silent. He refused to let prejudice define his worth. He refused to let injustice go unchallenged. His actions forced an institution to face an uncomfortable truth. Discrimination isn't always blatant. Sometimes it's subtle, systemic, hidden behind professionalism. It lives in small moments. The hesitation in a voice, the extra scrutiny, the refusal to offer the same trust others receive. That's what makes it so insidious. But this story isn't just about one man's stand. It's about everyone who witnessed it. It's about those who stayed silent and later regretted it. It's about those who could have spoken, but chose comfort over courage. And it's about the few, like Sarah, who realized silence is complicity and vowed to change. Change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes when people choose better, confront their biases, and speak out. James Harper's fall wasn't just about his actions. It was about the arrogance of unchecked power. He thought he was untouchable, that his assumptions were infallible, that he could humiliate someone without consequence. But power without accountability is fragile. The moment the truth emerged, his authority collapsed. True power lies in respect, integrity, and fairness. Once people saw who Michael was, the power dynamic shifted permanently. It shouldn't have taken status or wealth for him to be treated with dignity. His rights should have been respected from the moment he entered. That's the lesson. Respect isn't based on assumptions. It's owed to everyone. Always. So, what would you have done? If you'd been in that bank, would you have spoken up? Would you have challenged the injustice, or let fear, discomfort, or hesitation silence you? Comment your thoughts. How can we combat discrimination daily? If you believe in standing up for justice, like, subscribe, and share this story to spread the message of challenging prejudice and advocating fairness. Thank you for watching, and remember, change starts with us. Let's do better. See you in the next story.